Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. We will just give it another minute to let more people join and then we'll kick off. Okay, let's get going. So welcome everyone. This is ITPN's first webinar of 2026. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Jacques Morris, I'm the head of the ITPN, and I'm very excited about this webinar. I'm going to say a few words before we kick off. So if you didn't already know, the International Transition Plan Network is a growing network of 40 government ministries and regulators across 24 countries. We are focused on how private sector transition plans are supporting finance flows and climate goals. So transition plans matter because they bring climate right into the center of business strategy and capital allocation. And we're really focused on that specific piece of how transition plans can mobilize finance. Ultimately, they are strategic, forward-looking documents. They are an enabler of business growth and long-term resilience. So we see a huge opportunity here. And this is why transition plans continue to be a key topic during what has been a turbulent year. We've been tracking global developments on transition plans on this interactive map, which you can see on our website. And it shows some very interesting trends over the past year. So in the EU, we had the omnibus process, where we saw that transition plans became front and center of a lot of debate. Ultimately, we saw that they were removed from the due diligence directive whilst being retained in the sustainability reporting directive. More globally, ISSB standards are now being adopted by 37 countries, including most major economies. And mandatory disclosure comes into force in most of the G20 in the next 3 years. And that includes a provision on transition plan information. We've seen big advancements across the Asia-Pacific region, where disclosure regulations are coming into place across numerous jurisdictions, including Hong Kong, Singapore, Indonesia, South Korea, India, and China over the next 2 years. We also see that Brazil, Costa Rica, Nigeria, and other jurisdictions are requiring disclosures from 2028. And last year, Australia, the UK, and the UAE also consulted specifically on transition planning. And we finished the year with a new draft disclosure standard from China. So a lot has been happening over the past year. We also saw that at COP, transition plans featured in official spaces for the first time. The Baku to Berlin roadmap recognized that transition plans are critical underpinnings for sound financial investment and risk assessment. And it proposed that regulators create expectations for transition plans. So we are seeing a shift towards more policies and more regulations focused on disclosure that include transition plans. So we have a packed webinar for you today where we're going to unpack many of these topics. First up, we have Monet and Ben from the ITPN team, who will give short presentations on our flagship reports that we released in November. We'll then turn to our expert panel, which is chaired by Ben Caldecott, who is also the chair of the ITPN advisory group. And throughout the webinar, you can put your questions in the chat box using the Q&A function. And so please do that. And after the panel, we'll have 10 minutes to answer as many as we can. So I'm now going to hand to Monet, who's going to kick us off with a presentation on our first report.
Thanks, Doug. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on your time zone. As mentioned, I'm Monet, a policy advisor in the ITPN team, and today I'll be presenting some key messages from our recent report on private sector transition plans and their role in mobilising finance, looking at how this occurs and what evidence currently supports these mechanisms. Our research synthesizes emerging empirical evidence across multiple jurisdictions and sectors to identify 5 distinct mechanisms through which transition planning influences capital flows. We structure these mechanisms around 2 stakeholder perspectives: benefits accruing to users of transition plan information, so financial institutions, investors, and regulators, and then benefits to preparers, the companies or institutions that are engaging in the transition planning. The distinction is quite important because the mobilization of finance requires alignment of incentives across both of these groups. Financial institutions must perceive value in using transition plan information for capital allocation decisions, and corporates must experience tangible benefits that justify the resource allocation required for thorough and credible transition planning. I'll focus today on a short overview of each mechanism and leave you to go through them and their corresponding case studies in more detail at another time. So beginning with market confidence, transition plan disclosures provide a way to assess the credibility of commitments and feasibility of planned actions by allowing investors and other stakeholders to undertake contextualized evaluations. This can also mitigate reputational damage and reduce the risk of actual or perceived greenwashing and legal liabilities. This is particularly relevant for entity-level financing. Banks and investors know how to deal with clearly green activities like a fleet of EVs or a solar farm, but when it comes to general purpose financing, it can be trickier to distinguish. This is where the forward-looking strategic information contained in transition plans can come in handy, giving investors confidence that a company has a clear and achievable plan to transition. Secondly, transition plan information supports sophisticated risk management by helping financial institutions, companies, and regulators identify and price forward-looking risk. This can reduce uncertainty, increase resilience, and support financial market stability. And it's already happening. So an NGFS survey covering 37 global banks and insurers found that 93% are using or planning to use client transition plans in their risk management processes, both due diligence and stress testing. In addition, transition plan information could be used by prudential authorities to manage financial system stability, both as a tool to assess individual firms or even by aggregating transition plan information to inform predictions of future macroeconomic conditions and identify system-wide pressure points. Thirdly, information from transition plans enables financial institutions to systematically identify activities and companies with strategies to grow through or to create value from the transition. This feeds into decision-making about financial products, portfolio construction, and capital allocation. For example, OCBC, a Singaporean headquartered bank, uses transition plan information to understand clients' transition strategies and to identify and evaluate financing opportunities. There's a more detailed case study on this in the report, but it's also something we're starting to see a lot more uptake of among other investors and financial institutions, and something I'm sure Wei-Zhen will speak to later. Similarly, transition plans are being incorporated into financial product development across asset classes like sustainability-linked loans or bonds. Next, we'll turn to the preparer benefits, although I would like to note that many of the benefits to users that I've already mentioned will also create value for preparers. For example, by incorporating robust management plans for climate-related risks into their business strategies, companies can increase their overall enterprise resilience and strengthen their strategic positioning. But beyond these protective benefits, transition planning and implementation can also catalyze value creation and drive competitive advantage, which is our fourth mechanism. So credible transition plans can deliver measurable financial benefits to companies, including reduced operational expenditure and access to new revenue streams. It can also drive improved managerial capacity, improved relations with investors or other stakeholders, and improved competitiveness. And finally, disclosure of transition plan information can influence access to capital and financing costs. Companies may access financial advantages, such as improved access to capital for some sectors, lower cost of capital. For example, initial evidence from the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group shows that energy and utility firms with higher levels of transition plan disclosure can experience immeasurably lower debt costs. MSCI research shows that high emissions firms who are on track to meet their emissions targets are rewarded with lower corporate bond spreads. and firms who are not on track are penalised, suggesting the markets are distinguishing between credible on-track transition plans and off-track transition plans. However, this pricing is not uniform, with lower emitting sectors like financials not seeing this benefit or being penalised. This mechanism in particular would definitely benefit from some continued investigation to look into these benefits and how they're replicated across sectors. I recommend taking a look at the case studies in this section of the report too. There are some examples of companies using their transition plans to raise funds from new sources via green bonds or sustainability-linked bonds. In summary, the available evidence suggests that transition plans can and are already beginning to serve as infrastructure for scaling transition finance through multiple channels. However, the evidence base requires further strengthening, particularly to increase geographic and sectoral spread. Realizing these benefits will require wide-scale uptake and coordinated action, internationally consistent standards, supportive policy frameworks, and capacity building. I might leave it there for the moment, so thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A function and we can answer them after the panel if there's time. Otherwise, you can get in touch with us via email. But for the moment, I will hand to Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Monet, and hello, everybody. So to introduce myself, I'm Ben Gilby. I'm the technical lead here at ITPN. I'm going to speak for a few minutes on our second paper last year, which is on the topic of sector transition plans, which has been an emerging trend over 2025 that we expect to see continue into 2026. We wrote this paper with our colleagues at the TPI Global Climate Transition Centre at LSE. So to introduce the paper, a common question that we're often asked by both policymakers and companies is how can company transition plans and national policy be linked? We're already seeing there are some clear synergies and dependencies between company and policy action. So if for countries that are introducing a net zero target into law, that increases the likelihood of companies within that jurisdiction setting targets and vice versa. However, this goes beyond just targets. If you're a company based in a jurisdiction with more developed climate policy, such as carbon pricing or climate disclosure regimes, you're more likely to be implementing and have more comprehensive corporate transition plans, according to TPI analysis. So whilst companies are clearly linked to national policy in their transition plans, there's increasingly a recognition of the dependencies that companies face on national policy and other sorts of dependencies to implement their transition plans. So maybe technology dependencies, so things like the maturity levels of some technologies needs to increase for some sectors to decarbonize, or often they are policy related. So CDP analysis shows that regulatory frameworks and policy instruments are the second most common type of dependency after technology dependencies, identified by 67% of companies with a transition plan. One emerging solution that we've identified in this paper that can help companies navigate these dependencies are sector transition plans. These may have different names in different jurisdictions. They may be called sector plans or sector pathways, but ultimately what these are plans which are created by government in collaboration with industry that are specific to a particular sector in a particular jurisdiction. They should provide a vision that provides emission reduction and resilience goals, as well as a delivery plan to achieve these goals, covering the role of different technologies and policy to support that. And crucially, sector transition plans should also include clear financing plans. And this is something that we've really heard from the transition planning community over the last year. So if we move to the next slide, our paper identified three contributions that sector transition plans can play in bridging national ambition and company transition planning. So firstly, sector transition plans can help policymakers provide a really clear direction of travel about the transition. providing clear signals on the available policy support, as well as the expected speed of decarbonisation in different sectors. So to take one example, in France, there is a target to reduce industrial emissions 81% by 2050. And we've seen ADEME, the French Agency for Ecological Transition, developing sector transition plans for energy intensive sectors to show how they can deliver on this goal. The second contribution is that sector transition plans can help companies navigate the external dependencies that I mentioned and help them identify appropriate decarbonisation levers for that jurisdiction. So the EU Commission has recently published sectoral decarbonisation pathways, which have really comprehensive coverage of 24 sectors. And these will help companies not only set targets, but also understand the relative role that different decarbonisation levers are likely to play for each sector in the EU context. The third contribution I want to highlight is that sector transition plans can help facilitate transition finance. They do this by enabling financial institutions to understand the feasibility of a plan within the local context, which is really important to understanding the credibility of a plan as well as its financial and technological feasibility. So moving beyond analysis just against global benchmarks. So we've seen some emerging practice on this in Japan, where the government has produced technology roadmaps for 8 sectors, which have been widely used by companies to raise transition debt, with the market there reaching $17 billion in June 2025. In 2026, we expect this trend of jurisdictions underpinning NDCs and whole of economy planning with sector transition plans working with industry. So that's it on this report, and now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ben Caldecott from our advisory group for the panel discussion.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ben, and great to hear from both you and Monet. So I'm Ben. I chair the advisory group for ITPN, and I've been asked to moderate this panel discussion and also to provide just a few quick personal reflections on what happened in 2025. So I'll do that before introducing the panelists and getting into that conversation with them. When looking back at 2025, I think the simplest way to describe it is a mixed year of both headwinds and tailwinds, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. On the headwind side, obviously, we've had significant political and macro uncertainty, and that's made long-term commitments much harder to make. There was and will continue to be a lot of debate about what are appropriately ambitious climate targets for companies and financial institutions. That's partly linked to that political and macro uncertainty. I think some of that can be helpful. Some of those challenges are genuine as well. How do we make targets work in different sectors, different jurisdictions? What's appropriately ambitious? What's reasonable? But some of it is also certain institutions trying to find an excuse to get out of commitments, and that's been unhelpful. I think the other sort of trend we've seen in the last year has been a move away from kind of high-level principles to implementation, which is positive. People are caring less about whether a transition plan exists and more about whether it's decision useful, comparable, credible. Obviously, a lot of the work of ITPN is to try and support that. There was also a lot of policy churn in some jurisdictions, and that's led, I think, some preparers of disclosures, some companies, some financial institutions, led them towards a more kind of cautious, compliance-led posture. But at the same time, we've had some really positive momentum. So we saw and continue to see clearer signals that transition planning is shifting from a niche exercise to a part of mainstream reporting and supervision. We also saw many more jurisdictions moving towards disclosure regimes that incorporate transition plans, including through alignment with the ISSB baseline. And you've heard a bit about that already. And that matters, obviously, because it lowers the cost of adoption, it supports interoperability, and it increases the chance that transition plan information can be used consistently in the areas where it matters in capital allocation, risk management, product design, and so on. And the other thing is that we've seen a lot of activity in APAC. And in particular, there's a lot of momentum around ISSB adoption in Japan, and also links to their new ETS and transition plan requirements, which is very significant. But there are also other APAC developments that we might get into with the panelists. And this is really important because this is a region where many of the most consequential questions about scale, sequencing, competitiveness are now being worked through in real time. So a lot to learn from there. Okay, well, look, to further reflect on those developments and also to think a bit about what that all means for the future, we've got two really qualified and distinguished panelists from APAC. So we've got Edlyn Gurney, who is Director within the Sustainable Finance branch of the Australian Treasury. And under the Australian Government Sustainable Finance Roadmap, her unit is leading the development of climate-related transition planning guidance and Treasury responsibilities in ongoing delivery of the government's Green Bond Programme. So Edlyn, thank you for joining. And then we're joined by Weixiang Wang, who is Director of ESG Investment Management at Temasek, one of the world's largest asset owners. And he's responsible for driving ESG integration across Temasek's global portfolio to help strengthen long-term portfolio resilience and drive value creation. He's also responsible for advancing Temasek's net zero strategy and policy. And before joining Temasek, Weixiang worked in two bits of the Singaporean government, the Ministry for Sustainability and the Environment, and also the Singapore Economic Development Board. And then just as a quick reminder, we have a Q&A function. So please do type in your questions. I will get to see those, and then we will hopefully get through some of those questions as we go. So first question is for Weixiang. So Temasek, huge investor, you're investing for long-term sustainable returns across both climate solution leaders and high-emitting sectors in transition. What is Temasek's approach to investment decision-making when you're thinking about that, and how are transition plans being incorporated?
Thank you, Ben, for having me here and for the kind introductions. So by way of introduction, Temasek is a global investor headquartered in Singapore. So as of March 2025, our portfolio value is around Singapore $434 billion. As you rightly pointed out, we invest as a generational investor, focusing on having sustainability being embedded at the core of our mandate to deliver long-term sustainable financial returns. When it comes to our climate strategy and how we think about investments, I think we have set ourselves an ambition to achieve net zero for portfolio emission by 2050 and to halve our portfolio emissions by 2030 from a 2010 baseline. So to do that, we have been taking active steps towards reducing our portfolio emissions, investing in promising new solutions, investing in the brown to green transition opportunities, but also equally important, engaging our existing portfolio companies on their climate transition readiness and to adopt lower carbon practices. So specifically to your questions, I think it's useful to share that we embed ESG and sustainability across our entire investment life cycle, from pre-investment due diligence to post-investment engagements. And we take a consistent approach to all our investments. So be it a typical investment or even in the high-emitting sector. So for all our investments, we do a climate analysis. So that includes assessing the company's climate transition readiness. We will look at the company's transition plan if available. Otherwise, we will start to dive into areas like the company's emission profile, how they benchmark to their peers, exposure to potentially physical climate risk, transition risk, as well as opportunities arising from climate change. So similar to the ITPN view that transition plans provide a forward-looking perspective on how companies manage those transitions, we also assess whether the company has those credible plans in place to manage the longer-term effects of climate change. And I think the point about high-emitting sector is important because I think these are particularly important when we are investing in companies in high-emitting sector, because we want to know that they do have a credible transition plan where they can transition to products and services as well as their own practices that then contribute positively to climate objectives. Internally and as well as in our external disclosure, we call this climate transition investments. And we think this is we need to have a very credible assessment because in the short term, our portfolio emission would rise. And then how do we continue to stay true to our North Star of net zero by 2050 and halving the emission by 2030? Having a credible transition plan then becomes tremendously important. Maybe I'll pause there and hand the mic back to you, Ben.
Yeah, great, Wei Xiang. And I think that point around, the North Star for you as an asset owner, and also how you communicate this sort of quite tricky maneuver. It's one thing communicating investing in climate solutions. That's quite easy to convey to different stakeholders, but sort of saying, well, actually, our short-term, medium-term emissions might go up. That's much more challenging to articulate. And we will come back to that, I think. Okay, thank you for that. Edlin, so Australia, you have had a really busy year. I think you kind of deserve a gold star, multiple gold stars for all the things you've been doing. There's been an NDC update, there's a net zero plan, there's a national adaptation plan, there's a national climate risk assessment. You've produced 6 new sector emission reduction plans, probably the busiest OECD jurisdiction in terms of stuff coming out. Can you tell us a bit about Treasury's approach to transition plans within all of that, and how you're linking it to international norms and what you're thinking about in terms of next steps?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. So I just want to start by saying that in Australia, I'm joining you from Canberra, which is located in Ngunnawal country, and I'd just like to acknowledge all First Nations peoples potentially on the call today and from Australia. So yes, September last year was really an important month for climate policy in Australia. It's really these sorts of targets, plans and assessments that are the building blocks for government, the private sector and other key players, so that we can work together for a collective vision of the future, because it's BAU without coordination is really not going to cut it. They're also super valuable inputs and considerations when organisations are developing their own or undertaking their own transition planning. So for transition planning, the Australian government did commit to providing guidance to help Australian organisations, and this was done through our sustainable finance roadmap. This guidance is still under development, and it's going to be voluntary, and it is separate to our climate related disclosure regime, which does include some obligations for transition plan disclosure. We had some public consultations last year, and submissions indicated quite widespread support for the government developing this sort of guidance, and highlighted that people wanted further practical guidance to separately assist in both transition plan disclosure and planning. And so given that feedback, we've needed a bit more time. In terms of some general comments, I think for international norms, I think disclosures is, as we've sort of been talking about already, is really important. And I think that more detailed guidance that the International Financial Reporting Standards released last year on disclosing climate and entities' climate related transition plans is really helpful. But I think one of our comments is that generally to date, a lot of these materials have been very disclosure focused and are focused on meeting investment needs. So I think in terms of the gaps, there are a lot less materials that are actually directed at undertaking transition planning itself. And we think that better internal transition planning can help with disclosure and financing, but can do a lot more in terms of long-term profitability, value creation, and helping collectively work towards shared goals. And in that sense, we think that the Transition Plan Task Force's transition planning cycle that Ben, you were involved in, is a really valuable resource. But we also appreciate that transition planning will look really different depending on circumstances. So organisations with less climate risks are more likely to be undertaking high-level transition planning, whereas those with greater risks, it's going to be more complex and technical. And in Australia and other places, domestic contexts can also be very different. So NDCs and decarbonisation pathways, economies can differ. Australia has been really reliant on high-emitting industries, and we want to support workers and communities affected by the transition. First Nation communities in Australia are crucial partners. Estimations are about 70% of our land and water are owned, managed or co-managed by First Nations people and other rights. So there's really a lot to navigate, and we appreciate that many organisations will have lots of competing priorities and limited time to invest. So in Australia, stakeholders have really asked for more help to do this and are calling for more practical examples and advice, and that's what we're working to help deliver.
Great, thank you for that. So one tension we see in a lot of jurisdictions, particularly with finance ministries and government departments thinking about transition plans, is a sort of tension between those that think, this is, this is anti-competitive. It's yet another bit of bureaucratic disclosure requirements that adds a cost to business on the one. So you've got people making those arguments, and you've got others kind of going, well, look, actually, this can help us meet our climate objectives. It helps to make companies more resilient. It helps them to capture the opportunities. It creates opportunities for transition finance and so on and so forth. Obviously, many of us will be in that camp on this call, but I'm just wondering whether, do you have any reflections on how that debate has panned out in Australia? Was that an easy kind of fight to win, or is it still ongoing? And how's that been managed? How are you reflecting on that?
I think it's probably not ongoing. Like, we have a disclosure regime, so that's pretty clear. Like, that says that you do need to, so certain reporting entities, they do need to give information about their transition plans, and we've had financial reporting obligations for a long time, so that's not new, but the specific ones are. I think at the core, when I think about those key documents that we released, and this is more my opinion coming in here, is that if we can see companies that are looking at those documents, are looking at how you can have a shared vision for the future and are trying to align, that can't be a bad thing. And am I that bothered that I see that publicly or not? Not always. It makes sense to make it public when it does, and obviously they have to be mindful of any disclosure regime, regulatory requirements, and others, and investor needs. But I think you can live with both at the same time.
Yeah. And we noticed in your consultation, the team was looking at it, and it's prominent that you include adaptation in there. Be great to hear a bit more about why you thought it was important to include that.
So one of the documents you mentioned was that we did release our first national climate risk assessment last year, and that really it was quite sobering, and it really detailed the ongoing and intensifying effects that climate will have on Australia. Like, droughts are expected to increase in frequency and severity, fire seasons will continue to increase in duration and severity, sea levels will continue to rise, and we're expecting worsening coastal flooding and erosion. So I appreciate that the focus has been on transition planning, has been in the context of moving to a lower carbon economy, and there are many risks to address in the transition space. But in practice, if we're thinking more internal transition planning for a moment, effective planning can often benefit from considering physical risks alongside those transition risks. And that was recognised in the Network for Greening Financial Systems report last year on integrating financial adaptation and resilience into transition plans. And that report highlights that it can be a strategic approach. And while it is for financial institutions, it could be for others. We think that there are messages for non-financial as well. So physical risks can materially affect the feasibility and effectiveness of transition risks. Physical risks can influence location, technology, and other sorts of things in terms of pacing of capital investment. And not accounting for physical risk could put people on a pathway that might meet decarbonisation objectives but are really unrealistic or unachievable in a future climatic situation. So given that urgency in particular for physical risk in Australia, it just makes sense to cover that context. But again, our guidance is going to be voluntary. It's a tool. Hopefully it's going to be assist. So an organisation itself can really, like, if you want to do transition planning in one side and adaptation planning in another, separate, do one first, the other. Really, the key message is for both is that good practice is that it's linked back to internal business strategy. So at the end of the day, those ambitions and actions hopefully will be considered together along with the multitude of other decisions that organisations are always needing to make. And if I'm going to open that door to broader thoughts, it is that sometimes it even makes sense to go even further, and sometimes some organisations are considering other sustainability objectives, and that just makes sense. So nature and just transition goals can be very linked to what the climate goals are, and integrating these considerations early can identify cross benefits and co-benefits, and also try and avoid unintended harm. So it just makes sense. However people want to separate it for reporting or other sorts of things, fine, but we just think it generally makes sense to be looking at both.
Thanks, Edlyn. And we've got a congratulations to Australia. Very impressive progress on climate from one of the audience participants, which is great. Absolutely agree. Okay, we'll come back to some of those issues, particularly some of those other topics you just mentioned, Edlyn. But Wei Xiang, back to you. So obviously, you're based in Singapore, but your portfolio is global, spanning a whole range of different sectors and geographies. Can you say a bit about how you compare and assess the alignment of such varied investments? And do you think, taxonomies are useful for that process? And what kind of taxonomies are useful for that kind of process?
Thanks. Maybe before I answer that, just a couple of comments on adaptation and resilience as well. As you rightly pointed out at the opening, I mean, there are headwinds and perhaps more headwinds than tailwinds, right? Two step forward, one step back. And that's where adaptation and resilience become more important. So even at Temasek, we started to, since last year, about 12 to 18 months ago, started to place more emphasis on physical climate risk, as well as the adaptation and resilience of our key portfolio companies, really thinking through and also understanding how they are managing some of those risks as part of their transition readiness as well. Coming back to your question, Ben, I think the way we think about investment is aligned to our 2030 strategy, and that's really guided by what we call our 4 long-term structural trends, one of which is really around sustainability. The others are around, like, no surprises, the likes like digitalization, future of consumption, and longer lifespan. So when we think about sustainability, that's where we start to use taxonomies to develop an internal classification framework for investments, as well as the type of proportion of our portfolio that's aligned with sustainability, or what we call sustainable living trend. And in that, we take references from taxonomies from various jurisdictions and also from industry practices. I think taxonomy serves that role for us, but more importantly, when we think about whether our investments are aligned and how do we compare across investments, a lot is really around the monitoring of the progress of our company's transition. And for that, we actually do quite a bit beyond pre-investment assessment. We also very, very proactively engage with our portfolio companies post-investment, particularly on climate transition, guided by our internal climate transition readiness framework that provides a structured methodology to assess their maturity in assessing climate-related risk and opportunity. And that forms a way for us to have a continuous dialogue and engagements with our key portfolio companies. And we kind of look at this from various elements, including how they structure their governance, what's their strategy, their capital allocation, how they think about scenario planning, target setting, and of course, we track actual realized progress on a regular basis. So I think what's important for us, whether companies are making alignment, is really to recognize that this is a journey. They need to have a plan, and we engage and monitor how they track along those plans on a regular basis. And I think I'm glad to share that since we started on this journey several years ago, we have seen many of our key portfolio companies make quite tremendous progress in their climate transition readiness. Things like being much more robust in their scenario planning, greater integration of climate risk into their risk management framework, greater more clarity in terms of their transition plans, including how they are approaching decarbonization, how they are looking at potentially new revenue streams derived from the tailwinds. So I think the key point for us is leveraging what's out there, also leveraging our own internal framework, and also then using that to assess and track the progress of our companies over time.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful and a detailed answer as well. So we've got a number of different questions coming into the Q&A. Keep them coming. One of the questions I'm going to kind of rephrase slightly, but it's from Becky and is for both of you. Obviously, we've seen more and more evidence that 1.5 degrees is not going to be possible to achieve, that we might have reached that point already, and therefore concern about 1.5 degree targets. And I mean, obviously, in the asset owner world, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund flagged that, and there was I think advocating for SBTi to change from a 1.5 degree to a 2 degree target, for example. And that's obviously a way of addressing the fact that companies are wary of having to stick to targets that they won't meet, or they'll have to report as not having met. So how do we deal with that from an asset owner perspective and also from a policy perspective? Who wants to go first? Sorry,
let me
let
me take a stab at it first. I think the way we think about climate change and net zero is to take a very principled and science-based approach. I think the science do tell us that we need to be well below 2, 1.5 is possible. So I think from our perspective, To the extent that we can, unless science have changed, and that could happen based on what data is coming in, we are sticking to a 1.5 as our North Star for now. But again, we are principled and remain aligned to a science-based approach and less about whether it's 1.5 or 2, but we get guided by what science tells us. So in terms of engaging with our portfolio companies, I think that's where things like taxonomy, things like sectorial pathways, or even geographical pathways then start to actually come into play, more so than whether it's 1.5 or 2 degrees. We do try to understand the context of our portfolio companies, even though we try to take a principled and consistent approach to how we assess and monitor and engage with our companies.
Yeah. Edlyn, any thoughts on this question?
I think I guess, 2050 is close and far away all at the same time, and you're going to get there through more iterative steps and sort of looking, we've just done our 2035 target. So that is, that was quite relatively ambitious in terms of 60 to 70% below our 2005 levels. So we'll be working towards that and adjusting along the way. Governments are doing that with a multitude of different tools, some of which will sort of, I was talking about before, there's a lot of uncertainties, I guess, in the future. So how that looks like, and I'm not a climate negotiator here, so I'm not really going to comment too much about the 1.5 or the 2. It's the direction you're going and understanding the impacts and implications of that. We're seeing the effects of climate change on our weather and other systems today. So we are living in a changed climate. So it is, it's continuing to take those steps and continuing to make better investments into the future and continuing to accommodate risks. And the challenge of getting a global and a world in where we currently are there is very hard, but we just have to keep trying.
Yeah, and I think, clearly one implication of 1.5 degrees, but also 2-degree targets, following those science-based objectives, is that we're going to have greater conversations and continue to have more to say about carbon removals and scrubbing carbon out of the atmosphere to get temperatures back down. So that's also something that's a part of transition planning. So another question for both of you, and this is about the just transition. So again, from an asset owner perspective, how are you thinking about integrating just transition considerations? And then from a regulatory perspective, policymaker perspective, how are you thinking about that? Maybe Edlyn, you want to go first this time?
I think there's quite a few different tools. We did sort of we are in our draft guidance nominated just transition as sort of another sustainability goal, but it really is intrinsically linked to activities involved in sort of taking transition related actions. I think we've got communities in Australia, so we've got our net zero authority, which is really focused on communities, including coal communities, and how you take those people through. So you do need to have a real end-to-end solution. Like, it's not just high-level policy, it needs to be on the ground policy. So we do work with, in Australia we have states and territories, so we work closely with them. We also have best practice sort of for like First Nations and in energy. So it is a lot of planning and it is a lot of frameworks, and then not just taking them from the high level, but down to the day-to-day is how you're going to do it. Because at every level, it can affect an individual a lot. And we really have to be cognizant of that. So you do need end-to-end in terms of from the highest level to the lowest levels of support in your welfare systems and other sorts of things like that, to make sure that a lot of these changes and people aren't left behind, and more broadly, people can benefit from this opportunity to change how we do business.
Yeah. And from our perspective, when we think about our sustainability approach broadly, there are really 3 pillars, and climate and net zero is really one part of it. The other 2 aspects are nature positive, and the third one is inclusive growth. So we see just transition as an important element that is in the nexus between climate change and transition, as well as inclusive growth. So when we do make investments, we do, just like we have a framework to assess a company's climate transition readiness, also how the company approaches various aspects of social considerations and inclusive growth. So in the situations where they are overlapped, that's where we think about just transition and ensuring that the company is taking a robust approach to incorporating fairness, inclusive growth, and so on and so forth as part of their management practices. And if there's a transition project, so for instance, in a brown to green transition, I think we also look at more broadly than whether the company have the right practices to ensure in terms of transition of the workers, in terms of the jobs, in terms of the energy security of the location, and so on and so forth. So I think these are different aspects that we look at when we think about just transition. I think it's an important topic because transition cannot happen without just transition.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another question for both of you, and this is from Stephen. So essentially, you have ISSB S2, which says if you have a transition plan, you should disclose it, and then you have regulations like the sort of the pre-omnibus CS triple D, which obligated companies to have a transition plan. Obviously, that's now changed. What momentum, if any, do you see for that more kind of mandatory approach? You will have a transition plan. It will adhere to a particular target, or was that just sort of an artifact, and we're moving into a slightly different phase now? Or could we come back to that type of mandation? Views on these questions? Maybe, yeah, maybe Edlyn, do you want to go first, given the sort of the policy angle to that?
Yeah, I think if we think about sort of what I went through, organisations are so different. We've got organisations that work across not just Australia and multinational. So what does applying 1.5 there when they're working in different jurisdictions that might be applying different targets and goals? We have sectors that have different pathways to get there. There are some industries that can't decarbonize now that are super important for us as a society that we still want. So they need to come later or after it. So there's a lot of coordination, which a blanket approach is a bit hard. I think in the Australian regime, I'm not the regulator. I'm not talking on behalf of them there, but we did develop the policy. We've sort of said, well, we want you to disclose. We want you to tell people what are your risks and opportunities, and sort of a bit let the market decide. If people have put out huge amounts of risk, is an investor going to go, that's a great idea? Or will they be like, I think I'd like to see how you've addressed those risks before I'm going to be lending you X amount of dollars or buy your stock somewhere. So I think that naturally should speak to itself. And I don't want to, commit to any future policy, but that is how the approach that is being done at the moment here.
I think for many of us who have been in the sustainability space for a long time, we know that it is a long and winding route. I think it's important that we are continue to head in the right direction. So even as different jurisdictions may have different policy or even backsliding in policy, I think it's incumbent of all of us in the industry to keep moving forward, right? It could be 2 steps forward, one step back, but I think we need to keep heading in the right direction. I think just picking up on Adeline's point and also on some of the work that ITPN has done, I think there have been signals, maybe not a lot of data points, but some signals and evidence that points to companies with stronger disclosure, more credible transition plans are benefiting from financing costs, for instance, or from what the stakeholders are looking for. So I think some of this will continue to drive disclosure and encourage companies to continue to put out transition plans and make their transition plans more credible and more detailed over time. And hopefully, over time, we get more and more data points and more evidence to prove that this is really driving down financing costs. And that would, again, become a virtuous cycle to encourage more to do so.
Yeah. And I think if you take the premise that transition plans should be part and parcel of corporate strategy, it seems difficult to reconcile that with governments saying to companies that their corporate strategy should be 1.5 degrees, and that must be what they do. It's a sort of challenging to get governments to dictate what corporate strategy should be. Of course, governments can incentivize, control, do all sorts of things to encourage ambition and credibility, but that's a somewhat different approach. We've had a few smatterings of questions related to AI and tech and data centers, and obviously that's a huge area that's going to grow in significance. Obviously creates opportunities for the analytics around transition plans. It more structural challenges in terms of sectoral transitions and what it means for company transitions as well. How are you guys thinking about that? And maybe Edlin, is that a sector you've looked at? Is that something that you'll do more work on?
We haven't looked at it specifically for transition planning at the moment. I guess that's data centers have been around a while, but that increase that we've seen with AI is a sort of a new area. And I think that's definitely one to watch in terms of how those sorts of companies are looking at the future as well. So yeah, probably more watching than anything from us.
Wei Xiang?
I think very similar. I think we're still at the very early stages in terms of the use of AI globally. I think in Temasek, certainly we've started to use AI to think about how do we process a lot of the ESG and sustainability data that we're collecting in terms of assessing companies and so on and so forth. But in terms of the broader impact of AI on sustainability, on climate, I think the jury is still out. I think it can go in many different directions. But one thing is for sure, I think AI is here to stay, and I think we need to really think hard about the impact over the long term as some of these assets get built up and take off in the coming years. I think we all have a lot to monitor in this space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So a quick pulse check, given that you're both in APAC. When I was at Ecosperity last year, the sense was very much, there's all this craziness going on in the US, but we're, in some bits of Europe too, but we're going to crack on because it still makes a lot of sense economically, amongst other things. Is that still the kind of the vibe, given the continued uncertainty and geopolitical tensions that we're seeing in other bits of the world?
Maybe I can go first. I think from my perspective, not much has changed from Ecosperity in May. I think one of the biggest takeaway from Ecosperity last May is that I think a lot of action will happen in this part of the world, in Asia Pacific. A lot of solutions could come from this part of the world. A lot of the transition are going to come from this part of the world as well. And I think that's because I think in many cases there are other imperative, be it economic resilience and so on, that will continue to nudge this along. The other is really around the impact of climate change will also be felt very much in this part of the world, in Asia Pacific. So I think it's also incumbent on us to really think about how do we ensure that we can transit in an orderly manner. So I think Asia, from our perspective, is chugging along despite the challenges around the world because there's real practical implications.
I'd echo Wei Xiang's comments there and say, yes, many of our countries are going to be feeling the effects of climate change first, but there's also the opportunity too, in terms of new green metals industries. We've got in Australia, the renewable energy is, if you're just worried about like in terms of per megawatt produced, is the cheapest. If you're not worrying about 24-hour electricity that everyone seems to want, crazy, it is the cheapest that you can produce at the moment. So form of energy. So there's a lot of opportunity too. So I think, and particularly for us, natural resources in many cases are finite. There's only so much you can mine. So we do need to look to a future regardless.
Great. And then a final question for you both. What are you, in relation to transition plans, what are you most excited about in 2026, and what are you most kind of worried about, concerned about? Wei Xiang, do you want to go first, and then last word to Edlin?
I think most excited about it's around how sustainability is becoming more mainstream. I think it's no longer about being sustainable because it's the right thing to do. I think there's a lot more focused about why it matters to company materially, whether it's from an opportunity or risk standpoint. I think that's better for the whole sector and it makes it much more robust as we move forward in this space. In terms of what worries me, I think to the earlier point around adaptation and resilience, I think we are really just starting thinking about it around the world. It has really just picked up, I feel, in 2025, towards the second half of 2025 globally, including all the way to COP. I think it's something that we continue to have to work on, especially if the transition is not happening as fast as we would like.
I think I'm looking forward to more companies, hopefully, that are starting to look at transition planning and other elements of that in a bit more detail. I think people get a bit nervous that it's a lot and that there's so many resources that are being pulled in a lot of directions at the moment, but it could just be an initial review and then go, hey, it's not really for us at the moment, but in 3 years' time, let's do a planning that will be stepping it up then. And the nature of transition planning is iterative, and when it's done best, it's reviewed and adjusted over time. I think what I'm worried about is data gaps and other uncertainties that make people just stop. And I think the inherent nature of the transition and what is adaptation and not the unknowns means we have to start getting more comfortable in the unknowns, and we have to definitely start looking at what are the no regrets opportunities that we don't want to miss, and also the maybe just sometimes having to make some hard decisions which are a bit uncertain because of that nature of a climate and a transition and a technology we don't know about.
Yeah. Great. Well, look, thank you both for a really interesting conversation, and great to hear about what you guys are doing as well in your different jurisdictions. And we'll continue the conversation, but we'll wrap up now, and I'm going to hand back to Jacques. Over to you, Jacques.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thanks to Evelyn and Wei-Shang. I mean, that was a fascinating discussion. I've been taking lots and lots of notes. I mean, one thing that just really stands out for me is that we see transition readiness, transition planning as increasingly important for this variety of reasons around accessing capital, for meeting a range of economic and climate goals, and really some of the main reasons for that are, the physical risks that we see are present and increasing, and also the availability of solutions that are coming out of APAC and the opportunities as well. So yeah, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. I also need to thank Monet Mooney and Charlotte for organising this webinar. So thank you to them. And then lastly, to everyone, please stay in touch with us. You can follow us online. You can sign up to our newsletter, and you have the QR codes for the reports that we wrote there. Please do reach out to us. We'll be working on many of the themes that we've discussed today, this year, and we're keen to collaborate with as many as possible. So we'll close there. Thanks very much again to our panelists, to Ben, and have a great rest of your day.